Hello everyone, welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. Ahead of this month's upcoming China-EU summit, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen delivered a speech at the European Parliament. When it came to China's stance on Russia and its trade policies, she was particularly outspoken, launching what can be described as her harshest criticism of China to date. Looking at the content of her speech, the South China Morning Post described it as a major showdown. Von der Leyen claimed, saying, "We also know that China's steadfast support for Russia is exacerbating instability and insecurity in Europe. We can say that China is in fact providing support for Russia's wartime economy, and we cannot accept this. I have always emphasized that how China continues to interact with Putin's war will be the decisive factor in future China-EU relations." On trade issues, von der Leyen continued to accuse China of dumping subsidized excess capacity onto global markets. She also criticized China for implementing an export licensing system for rare earths, claiming that this would impact European manufacturers. Von der Leyen's criticism of China-Russia relations is very similar to the language used by NATO this year. At that time, NATO identified China as a so-called decisive enabler of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a stance that was even more radical than the official position of the EU. But that was last year's NATO, led by Biden. This year, after Trump's return, although NATO still makes veiled jabs at China, one obvious difference is that the statement does not mention China by name. According to foreign media reports, Germany's new Chancellor Merz was one of the NATO members most adamant about not naming China in the statement. Of course, this also required the final approval of the United States, which has the last word. Over the past year, von der Leyen's rhetoric toward China on trade issues has also become increasingly tough. In her speeches this January and February, as a response to U.S. President Trump's return to the White House, von der Leyen was once seen as extending an olive branch to China, expressing an open attitude toward deepening trade and investment relations. But afterwards, her attitude shifted again, as she continued to hype up issues such as the so-called restricted market access for European companies in China, lack of transparency in subsidies, and industrial overcapacity, while repeatedly criticizing China's implementation of rare earth export controls. Earlier, during his visit to Europe, Foreign Minister Wang Yi reiterated that the relevant Chinese authorities had even set up a fast track for rare earths specifically for European companies. There are people deliberately stirring up this issue between China and Europe with ulterior motives. In addition to this, in the field of trade, various other disputes between China and Europe continue to escalate, including the unreasonable high tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, restrictions on Chinese companies and products participating in the EU's public procurement of medical devices, and the ongoing establishment of barriers against Chinese enterprises in public procurement. Although China maintains political contact with the EU, when it comes to substantive issues that concern China's interests, it will inevitably fight back. An article published by the New York Times on July 6 pointed out that the EU has found itself caught in a geopolitical dilemma between China and the United States. On one hand, the EU is trying to reach a trade agreement framework with the Trump administration to avoid being hit with high tariffs. But on the other hand, the EU is dissatisfied with China's policies on issues like Russia and Ukraine, and has recently restricted the purchase of Chinese equipment on the grounds of unfair competition. However, faced with the turbulence in global trade, the EU has no choice but to maintain a relatively stable relationship with China, a global manufacturing powerhouse. The article writes that the EU was founded to promote cross-border commerce and has always been a staunch defender of free trade. However, as the United States disrupts the global trade system in order to reduce its trade deficit, increase fiscal revenue, and boost domestic manufacturing, the EU is becoming increasingly isolated. The article points out that the EU and China are still engaged in a delicate game of maneuvering. All along, the economic ties between the two major economies have been extensive. Many European countries still heavily rely on China for industrial materials, and Europe's exports to China remain considerable, especially since Germany has maintained close trade relations with China for a long time. Leona Fix, from the Council on Foreign Relations Europe program, bluntly stated that Europe has no China card to play. Although the EU, like the United States, also accuses China of so-called unfair trade practices, the high level of economic interdependence between China and Europe means that the EU has limited leverage to put pressure on China. The New York Times also noted that China recently gave the EU a lesson, making it face up to this reality. In response to U.S. tariffs, China has tightened export controls on rare earth magnets. These types of magnets are crucial for manufacturing a wide range of products, including cars, drones, factory robots, and missiles. Since China dominates rare earth production, such restrictions could have a serious impact on other countries. Initially, European policymakers hoped that China's export controls would mainly target American companies. However, European companies also suffered from delays in the approval process by the Chinese side. The article speculates that these delays are not only due to a backlog of applications, but are also related to long-standing trade disputes between China and Europe. In any case, when Ursula von der Leyen raised concerns on the eve of the China-EU summit, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs responded with a rational and calm attitude. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said that China's development is an opportunity for the EU, not a challenge. She expressed hope that the EU can become a trustworthy and reliable partner for China. Regarding all the EU's economic and trade concerns, Mao Ning pointed out that she hopes the EU will view China-EU economic and trade relations in a more comprehensive, objective, and positive manner. She emphasized that the EU should not only exaggerate differences and ignore cooperation, but should instead promote balanced and upward development of China-EU trade through mutual openness, properly handle trade frictions through dialogue and consultation, and avoid turning economic and trade issues into security issues. Subsidies are not unique to China, and the EU should not practice double standards on the issue of subsidies. To sum up a few observations, first, trade negotiations between the EU and the United States are not going smoothly, and in the end, the EU may have to make concessions. Europe does not dare to retaliate against the United States, but also finds it hard to explain this to its own public and voters, which is why von der Leyen and her team are all feeling uneasy. Second, she vents her frustration on China, trying to show a tough stance toward China, but at the same time, she doesn't dare to completely fall out with China. As a result, while criticizing China, she still has to go to China to meet with President Xi. According to tradition, this year's China-EU summit should have been held in Brussels, but President Xi couldn't arrange a visit to Europe, and the EU leaders still wanted to meet him, so they had no choice but to go to Beijing themselves. Third, under Trump's tariffs, China is intentionally seeking to quickly improve relations and enhance cooperation with the EU, but the EU itself gave up the option of joining forces with China to counter the US, so China and the US reached a framework agreement first, leaving the EU in an awkward position. In fact, this is even more forceful than Trump's bullying tactics. According to recent foreign media analysis, his tariff war hasn't even managed to hurt China. On July 8, Bloomberg cited analysis saying that Trump initially targeted China, but soon realized that this kind of bluffing had little effect on China, so he could only claim victories from smaller countries. An economics professor told the South China Morning Post that the biggest losers will be the smaller Asian economies with large trade surpluses with the US. The US may be able to squeeze more concessions from these smaller countries. Bloomberg reported that the Trump administration's move to delay the tariff implementation date to August 1st was partly aimed at squeezing the best possible final offers from economies that Trump believes are still willing to make a deal. However, at the same time, this push-and-pull in policy could also increase the burden on American importers and households. Trump and his senior aides have repeatedly claimed that dozens of countries are scrambling to negotiate trade deals with the US. But so far, the Trump administration has only announced agreements with the UK and Vietnam, and a framework agreement with China. Derek Scissors, a China expert at the American Enterprise Institute, said this process will continue because Trump likes it this way. He enjoys boasting and being in the spotlight. He'll secure enough wins from smaller partners to make it seem worthwhile. But Scissors said this approach has little effect on China. He said what we're likely to see is a continued delay on trade issues, with more and more small deals being made with those smaller countries. They believe it's worth throwing some benefits to the US just to avoid trouble. But the Chinese won't do that. To sum up simply, after Trump made a high-profile announcement on April 2nd, Liberation Day, about launching a tariff war against the world, 3 months have passed. It turns out that implementing Trump's grand tariff plan has been even harder and slower than expected. Trump has been bragging, but as the 90-day pause period, July 9th, approaches, the U.S. has only managed to reach agreements with a handful of countries. One key reason is that China isn't giving in, which has deflated Trump's momentum. Even when facing such a strongman in America, China still doesn't bow down. The EU tries to act tough with China, but in reality, it doesn't have any real China card to play.